So, Dr. Vinicius de Carvalho, thank you very much indeed for your time.
My pleasure.
So, you're senior lecturer in Brazilian Studies at King's College. You also the author of the book Military Music in the War of the Triple Alliance, and you are the chief editor of the academic journal Brasiliana, and you contributed to the exhibition catalogue of the current exhibition here now, The Art of Diplomacy, Brazilian Modernism Painted for War. So you're pretty busy indeed.
Oh, it's part of life.
So we are here to focus on the exhibition that is currently on show here at the Embassy of Brazil in London, and which references the 1944 exhibition, which was held at the Royal Academy of Arts in the middle of World War II. Pretty big historic event. So my first question to you is, in your view, in terms of contemporary contexts, have the British public who are interested in world art and British cultural institutions changed their perceptions or misconceptions of Brazilian art and Brazil as a country since 1944?
Well, I think the answer for your question is a yes and a no. In some way, it changed a lot the perception of Brazil, of course, and the Brazilian art from 1944 up to today. That has to do with the immense development of Brazilian art and the expansion of the market of Brazilian art, in some way a professionalization of this market of art, and also with the engagement of Brazil in the world since then. So Brazil today is not the Brazil of 1944, as well as not Britain. And that means that the interactions, the global interactions, are much more developed and deeper. In other hands, there is always a sort of expectation towards Brazil of being an exotic place, and everything coming from there should have or reflect some sort of exoticism. Right. And I think this expectation is still there. Recently, in one of the journal articles that referred to the exhibition here, if I well remember, was in the Times, the critic who wrote the article was talking about the exhibition, demanding from it what the exhibition was not actually trying to say. And I think that is exactly what it has, the 1944, with this exhibition in common, and what didn't change so much. I think the questions and demands and expectations from Britain are not exactly what the Brazilian artists want to show or to tell. So the dialogue was not so easy here, because it's like the Brazilian artists saying something and the British audience expecting to hear something else. So this is something that probably is still here. But this tension is very necessary and very good, because it's exactly this tension that makes the exhibition, again, so exciting today, because it tries to break this tendency, especially an external tendency in looking at Brazilian art in general, both music, literature, or visual arts, as both extremes. Or in one side, it must be an art denouncing the social problems of underdeveloped countries, so engaged art, or in the other hand, being an art that shows the exoticism of a beautiful nature, of the sun, the tropical weather. So I think this exhibition, it breaks this sort of binary tendency of looking at Brazilian art in general.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I do think, though, that given the history of Brazilian modern art and how avant-garde some of those artistic experiments in Brazil taking place in the early modernist period in Brazil, would have been a little bit difficult for perhaps the British wider audience to understand. Perhaps I think that France or the French, because of obviously the history between France and Brazil, would have had a better understanding of some of those works of art that were shown in the period, but also currently. Seems to me, perhaps I'm wrong. But
the interaction between France and Brazil was normally and historically much more fluent and constant than the British, for example, and especially in the early modern, not early modern because that would be understood as Renaissance basically, but in the early modernism period, in the beginning of the 20th century. Many of those artists, they study or went to France for a while, and in some way, France helped to demand or to ask from those Brazilian artists what they want to say. It's very interesting when we think about music. That's another art that I'm quite involved with. Villa-Lobos went to France the first time, and he came performing lots of music that emulate a lot of French impressionist music, especially Debussy.
Right.
And the French audience asked him, so what do you have original to tell us? What sort of originality can you bring as a composer from Brazil? And then is when Villa-Lobos start to incorporate some of those folkloric elements in his music and start really to be this father figure of the nationalism in Brazilian music.
Right.
So it is towards a French demand, a French questioning of his originality. And then this helps in the dialogue because there is a question, there is a demand. There is not an expectation in the sense of what I want from you or what I think that you will give to me. I have really doubts about what you want to show or to give. And that is, I think, the differential element of this period. And our modernism in Brazil was still a movement that was trying to make Brazil as known as all other countries in Europe in the field of the arts. So it is also to show that we can talk to you in the same level. We can develop an art that is in the same level as your art. And this is another important point to be discussed here because yes, our artists, they are trying to be in the same way of expression that we are seeing here in Europe. Right. That will change definitely, especially from the moment that those Brazilian artists, they start to discover that as much as they become original as Brazilians, as much as they will be modern in a Brazilian sense.
That's very interesting. In fact, currently it's a very interesting period for Brazil in terms of politics and the economy, of course. Slightly darker there on that spectrum, but culturally, this is what strikes me about Brazil, is that currently you've got the Beatriz Milhazes show at the White Cube in London, who is a Brazilian artist, very talented, based in Rio de Janeiro, represented in London by a major private art gallery. And then you've got this current exhibition here in the gallery of the Brazilian Embassy. And you've got, for the first time, a whole exhibition dedicated on the painter Tarsila do Amaral, who is part of the very first generation of Brazilian modernism at MoMA Museum in New York. This is huge and very, very inspiring. So this leads me to the second question I've got here for you. So reflecting on this post-colonial avant-garde Brazilian anthropophagic manifesto set out by Oswald de Andrade, which could be understood as celebrating cultural and racial hybridity through the symbolic action of devouring the culture and the colonizers in order to reach a more evolved society. Do you think then that the avant-garde discourse would have been understood by the British in the 1940s? Because in terms of post-colonial history, it's pretty progressive, isn't it?
Well, I would say that, and that's one of the arguments of my current research on cultural anthropophagy as a hermeneutics of alterity. I would say that even today, people don't understand very well what or how to explain or how to conceive this idea of cultural anthropophagy. And well, first of all, I would not say that Oswald's Manifesto Antropofágico, translated as Cannibalist Manifest, it was understood by him as a post-colonial like claim. We call that post-colonial today.
But nowadays, in retrospect.
Exactly, in retrospect. But for Oswald, it was just a foundational text about what would be a Brazilian art. A Brazilian art that would be not in opposition to European art or any other art or any other culture, not only art, but would be a culture that is inclusive in a quite violent way. Because devouring the other is a violent act.
Yes, indeed.
And all the language, exactly, anthropophagically speaking, it's really a devoration of another. Yes. And this was constantly understood metaphorically, of course, as a metaphor of taking or appropriating what is from another. That could be the colonizer, but could be also from other cultures that are not necessarily the colonizers of Brazil, in order to create a pattern of a culture that doesn't define as an exclusive but an inclusive. So the idea of Oswald is very interesting. Brazilian culture, it's not a culture that defines in opposition to another, but in relation to the other, taking what I want from this other to make it myself. If we play that today in some methodological or even philosophical aspect, what we are talking is also a provocation about alterity, how I deal with the foreigner, how I deal with the stranger. In a world like today, in which we are closing more and more our doors and gates and frontiers and borders and defining what is me in opposition to another, I think this manifesto has a very important ethical claim today, that what makes a strong culture, it's not protecting against the other, but is actually interacting with the other, interacting in a very advanced ontological exchange. And that is, I think, when we read, for example, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, the Brazilian anthropologist who wrote that fantastic book, From the Enemy's Point of View, describing what means exactly for the Tupinambás indigenous in Brazil to practice cannibalism, what sort of ontological perception was there, and in which he also created this or developed this concept of perspectivism. If we bring these things together, then we can talk about a post-colonial discourse. And then we can talk that from 1928, when Oswald wrote the Manifesto Anthropophagic, until today, if we read and the development of a sort of construction of an idea of Brazilian culture, and why not to say ontology, what we are trying or could make the world understand better is it's not really putting aside the different, the other, that I will protect myself and I will make myself stronger, but it's the opposite. It is relating to this other in a sort of anthropophagical, ontological, philosophical way, or artistical. That's what is in the game here, no? Yes. That's why I think that the Manifesto Anthropophagico was not understood in 1928 or 40s here when the exhibition arrived with this art that is anthropophagical. And is not either today, because we are still looking at this in a sort of defined Brazilian culture in opposition to the other cultures, and especially British culture. While Brazilian artists, I know, I don't want to be understood as opposition to, but as integrated, as in a process of constant redefinition of meanings through these anthropophagical processes, these cultural anthropophagical processes.
Hence I think it's an incredibly progressive and avant-garde movement and manifesto, certainly for that period.
Yeah.
And I don't think, certainly the Brazilians did not understand, the wider public in Brazil, a lot of the local Brazilian bourgeoisie, both in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, was looking to France.
Yeah.
So, and so therefore this manifesto was incredibly progressive for the period, but neither for Britain, that owned, in 1944, still owned a huge colonial empire. So talking about cultural appropriation, and as opposed to segregation, would have been a very controversial thing, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, the problem with empires, and that was not different here, is that they always think that they are bringing civilization to the place where they are going, and that's what makes them imperialistic.
Indeed,
or not taking into consideration the other that they are meeting in the same way of looking equality to an other, or dialogue in a dialogal way. So it is an impositive colonial process. In 1944, that was Britain, still a colonial power, and that believed that from Britain we could expand the civilization to the world. And looking at Brazilian art will be always like, okay, we can refine these things to make it more close to the civilization. That's exactly the misunderstanding of this, the way of looking at this exhibition. Brazilian artists were not coming here to be approved by British audience, but on the other hand, the Brazilian artists were sending their work here because they say, okay, we are going there to also eat you. That's a very how to say that, it's a very post-colonial way to act.
Right.
No? It's to take in the voice. It is not to be in the position that somebody came here to choose which arts I want to bring to London. We are deciding by ourselves what we want to show to the world through the London eyes.
And it's interesting, perhaps in comparison to other Latin American countries in the period, I think Brazil, by setting out those priorities, of, for instance, through the anthropophagic movement, it was encouraging a racial and cultural hybridity, which is something that I touch upon in my master's thesis as well, when I talk about Flavio de Carvalho's works, I suppose, compared to, for instance, Argentina.
Yeah. This is a very interesting topic and very controversial one, but we need to touch on it. From the 20s on, Brazilian racial discourse start to try to build up this idea of a sort of homogeneous community that integrate all sorts of different ethnic backgrounds. And curiously speaking, and in a very perverse way, continue to segregate certain groups, especially the Afro-descendants and the indigenous.
Indeed.
But at the same time, appropriating their cultural expressions as Brazilian cultural expressions. So that's why I'm calling that a little bit perverse way, because in the same way that those communities, the Afro-descendants, the indigenous people, they were suffering more and more and continue doing that. Segregation in the Brazilian society, everything that starts to define what is Brazilian culture start to come from those groups. So the Manifesto Antropofágico is a good example of that, is the idea of indigenous anthropophagy. Yes. So all this Indianism or indigenism in the Brazilian arts. Macunaíma, it's another example of that. And there's also the moment that we start to accept and glorify samba, choro as Brazilian music, as being Afro root in Brazil. It's also the moment that we start to have all this construction of a sort of Brazilian Afro culture with capoeira and etc., and use that as actually a product to show to the world that look how we are integrating. We don't have racial issues because our culture is being defined by this mixture. So that's what I think is always a paradox for me, because in some way it is an anthropophagy towards those groups, because the Brazilian standard culture devour the culture coming from the Afro-descendants and the indigenous, for example, and make it Brazil, but left those real people still neglected socially and economically.
And that, of course, is still an issue.
It is still today, absolutely.
Absolutely. But I think there are certain critics of the Week of Modern Art in São Paulo going back in 1922 and the first stage of the Brazilian modern art movement, and some of whom, is a Professor Rafael Cardoso. He studied his PhD at the Courtauld Institute, and he's an art historian. He wrote a very interesting article called Brazilianness of Brazilian Art, in which he claims, of course, he very much values the contribution of the 1922 Semana de Arte Moderna, Week of Modern Art of São Paulo, and what artists such as Tarsila do Amaral and Cândido Portinari did in terms of visual arts and fine art, in showing this anthropophagic movement through painting, for instance. But he claims that had started really in the 19th century, even though it was expressed through the romantic or realistic sort of aesthetic in painting. Many artists were already showing the realities of Brazil and showing the common people, whether the peasant in interior parts of Brazil. So that dialogue perhaps was already starting then. What happened with the Semana de Arte Moderna is that became all very initially set out by the very sons and daughters of the coffee plantations, the elite of the coffee plantations in Brazil, in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. So do you think that perhaps Oswald de Andrade was a little bit too naive, nationalistic and ambiguous with his discourse in terms of not recognizing what had started before the week of modern art?
We should say, first of all, that all sort of nationalism is a little bit naive, and always ambiguous.
Yes.
So
and there's a quote here before.
Any time that we claim that some nationalism is the solution, that is a really naive and ambiguous way of reacting. But sorry, I interrupt you.
No, absolutely no. Sorry, I think it's an interesting detail here for us to add before you give your answer to this question, because he gave a speech at the Sorbonne in Paris. So Professor Rafael Cardoso mentions the new artists linked to the Semana de Arte Moderna, the Week of Modern Art of São Paulo, were, and Oswald de Andrade mentions, setting the basis for a truly Brazilian and current painting. How? De Andrade carries on. By adopting the modern processes deriving from the Cubist movement in Europe.
Yeah.
That's quite interesting, quite funny. This is the paradox.
Yeah.
So, and if you look at Brazilian modern artists from the period, and I'm not here critiquing, saying that this is a bad or a good thing, but they were inspired by many of the European modern artists. Tarsila, if you look at the colors, the painters who she would have looked at, the collaborations when she lived in Paris, and in fact, the exhibition are currently on show at MoMA. The catalogue very interestingly mentions, her nickname. The Tarsila dressed in Poiret, the French couturier. There was constant dialogue between Paris and São Paulo, for instance, in the case of her work. So some of his discourse may come across very nationalistic, and that is the issue I've got when he makes a speech like that at the Sorbonne.
First of all,
what are your views on that?
Let's start from the beginning of your question. We tend to talk that Brazilian modernism started with the Week of Modern Art in 22. That is a sort of event that marks the axis of a movement or several movements inside Brazilian art. But absolutely, this is a process. The definition of what is modern art in Brazil or modernism in Brazil, it is a process that, yes, has its beginnings in the 19th century, already during the Romanticism, trying to make it original Romanticism towards what's coming from Europe. For example, in music, we will have that with composers like Alberto Nepomuceno, who start to compose leads in Portuguese, what before was only in Italian, or sometimes in German. But so the introduction of Portuguese in a Brazilian pronunciation in the classic music, or other composers like Francisco Valle, that nobody heard about him, who lived also in France, he studied with Massenet, César Franck, and wrote, for example, Bailado na Roça, a suite in 4 movements, ending with a samba. So that's 19th century. We are not talking still in Villa-Lobos creating the national music in Brazil, and we have others like that. The language, the musical language, is still a quite romantic musical language. There is nothing that we would say, wow, this is absolutely new here from this Brazilian perspective. And that also in the painting, in the trying to discover something that would make original, would make Brazil, Brazil. Well, let's remember some important things. Brazil got independent in 1822 from Portugal. Until there was just a simple colony. Besides being bigger than the metropole, it was really a faraway colony. So in 1822, Brazil becomes independent as also empire, with a king that was a Portuguese successor in the Portuguese throne. So it's not that Brazil start really defining an identity as country, and it's very natural that the process of the Brazilian art from the independence was an art trying to find a voice, trying to find an identity, trying to find a picture of the self. that's the long process of the 19th century. And the Week of Modern Art in 1922 is exactly 100 years after the independence of Brazil. It's like the Brazil becoming adult enough to show that we have some art, no? And again, when you talk about the colors, about the influences of European art in Brazil, and let's remember the strong influence of French or French expression artists in Brazil. We cannot forget that Blaise Cendrars lived in Brazil, was close friends of many of those artists too, and was one who celebrated this new world coming from Brazil. Well, those artists, especially who lived the First World War, they look at Brazil as a sense of the place for the new man. No? Paul Claudel, who was the ambassador, French ambassador in Brazil in 1919, if I well remember, he brought with him Darius Milhaud, the composer, to be his secretary. And Milhaud wrote Saudades do Brasil, Le Boeuf sur les Toits, and several other pieces inspired by Brazilian popular music. We are talking before Villa-Lobos doing choros and etc. Milhaud was already doing Brazilian music in this sense. Right. And together they made this ballet, L'Homme sans désir, that is sort of the new man that is being born or coming from the jungle to redeem the world after the war. So there is a sense of something new will come from this new world. And Brazil represented that very well. And that's what's interesting here, because they were trying to find the new with old forms. We are trying to speak a new language with the old syntaxes. So we are not changing the syntaxes, we are just changing paradigms.
Right.
So I'm just substituting some elements from one language with elements of other language, but we are not changing the way of thinking or the way of expressing.
Right.
And that's exactly what this modernist movement represents. It is a paradigmatic change, but it's not a syntagmatic change.
Right.
That's why I don't think that we could call that a post-colonial movement, because in some way it is doing more or less like the Jesuits did when they learned Tupi Guarani in the beginning of the colonization. They just substitute. They were still thinking in Latin. You see, the syntaxis was still a Latin syntaxis, but with indigenous words, replacing Latin words. No, so in some way, that's what the art was doing. We are taking Cubism, we are taking other futurism ideas and trying to make that with a Brazilian face, but was still the syntaxes of the Cubism and the syntaxes of futurism.
That's a very interesting reflection indeed. So leading on from that, there's one aspect of Brazilian modern art that I've picked up on, and that I think is really interesting. That's called humour, which is a really, really big thing in the UK as well.
Yes.
Very important. And humour is a very important and interesting aspect which Professor Don Aids touches upon in his reflections, Modern Brazilian Painting, for the 2018 exhibition catalogue. In his text, he mentions, and I quote, "The humour manifested itself sometimes as a kind of carnival spirit. I would mention They Amuse Themselves, which is currently by Cardoso Jr., which is currently on show here at the exhibition, as having a seductive, playful element." And of course, I'm thinking about the British audience who would have seen this painting, confronted themselves with this painting in 1944. I'm also thinking about the 1956 performance by Vinicius de Carvalho, another Brazilian modernist, whose works I wrote about, in the center of the city of São Paulo, where most men would be wearing bowler hats, three-piece tailored suits, perhaps the same fashions as British men would be wearing here in London, which is pretty extraordinary in the tropics with that heat. But there's a lot of humour involved in that particular performance that I think de Carvalho sort of drew upon. So could you comment on this characteristic element of Brazilian modernism, which I think is very peculiar, or culture generally, in relation to a more severe European modern movement or modernist movement?
Yeah. The first point to remember is that the modernist movement in Europe was touched deeply by the experience of war. And it's so difficult to find humor after a war experience. You know, it's the resilience necessary to rebuild the societal ties, and the picture or the building of a society demands, it is naturally more severe. The traumas of the war are present. You see them every day. You see them in every corner and every person. Every family was touched by a loss in a war, especially the First World War, and especially here in Britain and in France, for example, Germany also. We didn't have that in Brazil. We didn't we didn't had the amount of families touched by the experience of war in Brazil. So this is one important point to take into consideration, a historical, societal aspect that make these societies absolutely and countries absolutely different in that moment. Besides that, there is a second aspect that I would add, and relating it to the Flávio Carvalho performance, is exactly the word performance. Humor exists through performance, and it's not something that you can easily picture it, and it depends a lot of the contextual performance of it. And then one piece of art that we see today in this exhibition that in 1944 had a huge humorous impact, detach it from that context and bring it to London would be demanding too much from a single piece of art to bring together the context in which that humor was performatively part of. And then I think this is another element to put in this picture here. We can only have this full aspect, rhetorical aspect of humor as it is common in Brazilian art, because of the capability of the performativity of this art. So it's through the performance that this art express and incorporate humor. And then this humor has a strong power over the audience that is watching or participating in this performance. And I think those are the elements that make so complex this comparison between perception of humor here and there, or in Brazil and here in 1944 especially. You know, first this element of the war, the experience of war, these traumas of the war, and the second one, and again in 44 with a war going on right now here. And the second one is this aspect of the performativity, or this necessity of perform that allows to a more disruptive and subversive action of the art. And that is Flávio Carvalho extremely good at.
So in fact, he lived in England for about, I think, 8 years, and he lived in England through the Great War. So he was initially living in Paris, and then he moved to England. He came to England to visit, and he got stranded here because the war had just started. He could not go back to France, so he ended up studying here engineering to please his father, but also fine art.
Yeah.
And he fell in love with theatre, British theatre, and etc. So he had a lot of correspondence with British artists at the time, even after going back to São Paulo. But of course, he drew so many incredibly interesting intellectual references from Freud, for instance.
Yeah.
A huge Freud reader, but mixing up with the most popular Brazilian of all celebrations, which is Carnival.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is magnificent to see that we sort of mixed it together during that particular performance in 1956. And he was a huge critic of European wars. I mean, I went through some of his inventories and accounts, and the documents are fascinating. He did believe, as a typical Brazilian modern artist, that Brazil was the right sort of solution for the world. Mm-hmm. In other words,
yeah.
To reconstruct the world from these imperial wars or interests happening in Europe, And he commented on that with a lot of humor.
Yeah, and this is amazing, because when you talk about that, we need to bring into the discussion another fantastic intellectual who lived and died in Brazil, Stefan Zweig.
That's right.
Who in 1942 published that book, Brazil, Land of the Future. And exactly somebody who escaped from Europe and also lived in England. He lived in Bath before moved to Brazil. So Stefan Zweig was the humanist mentality of Austro-Hungarian Empire, a fantastic, well-known, translated author, extremely known all over the world, who moved to Brazil and discovered also this magnificence of Brazil, who writes about Carnival with a huge surprise, but in a very different aspect. He looked at Brazil as the future, because he projected in Brazil everything that what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's curious, he writes 2 books at the same time. He writes The Land of the Future, and he writes his autobiography that's called in English The World of Yesterday.
Right.
Die Welt von gestern and the Land of the Future, the Land der Zukunft. So he looks at the same time in Brazil as the possibility of a place that will be the future, but this future is the past that I lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's again the civilization, no? So the world that he lived was the ápice of a civilized world,
right,
that the war destroyed, disrupt. So where will we have that again? In Brazil. Because that's where we can rebuild these values. With Austro-Hungarian values, not with Brazilian values. That's what makes him so different from Flávio Carvalho, for example.
Yes,
for example.
Yes. No? Very, very interesting. So I think moving on more towards the sort of diplomacy as a topic, which is of course very much related to the current exhibition here in the gallery of the Brazilian Embassy. So you contributed to the catalogue of this embassy with a really beautiful text, and you finished your text dedicated to the current exhibition catalogue with a powerful and compelling conclusion. The art of diplomacy teaches us a lot about Brazil, a country which does not only want to be seen as a military power, but also wishes to be recognized for its trailblazing ability in both art and also diplomacy to speak up in the face of global tyranny. I thought it was a very interesting, that's how you conclude the article. Looking in retrospect, do you not think that the Vargas government rather adopted a pragmatic approach in joining the Allied forces, sending then the armed forces to Italy to fight the Nazis back, as opposed to be openly shocked and horrified by the brutality and atrocities of the Nazi regime, which back then he would have been aware, in particular against the Jews?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I think the first thing we should take into consideration is that it's not so easy to make black and white picture of what was the decision to join or to engage in a war. You can support without support, you can acknowledge without acknowledge. So diplomacy, especially around decisions of wars, are never an easy decision to make. We need to put in this picture also a second very important character, both for the Brazilian engagement in the war and for this exhibition. That's Oswaldo Aranha, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Vargas during a certain period, who was behind, because of him this exhibition happened basically also. And also we need to look at his dialogues with the allies in order to bring Brazil as a military contributor to the war too. I think this is a very important element to put here. That's Aranha, who looked much more globally, while Vargas looked much more internally to Brazil. That's one important point to have here. The second point is that, for example, USA didn't join the war because of the atrocities committed against the Jews by Germany, but was motivated by other reasons, because also they were attacking Pearl Harbor. And so this is The question of putting a country in the war because of something that happened to another people, it's a very difficult decision to be made.
It's a moral.
It's this
Creates a moral case.
Exactly. It's pragmatically speaking, a country will just not join the war of somebody else just because of an atrocity. That will be very rare. You know, unless you suffer an aggression, you are not putting all your efforts into a war. You know? Of course, when we write the macro history, we can include that as a good motivation, and will be good for our history books and for the in the future generations look back and say how we engaged to the war to save the world from the tyranny, etc. But yeah, it is a pragmatical decision always. But I would like to return to the figure of Aranha, who was for me here the key element in this arrangement, in this concert, putting Brazil part of these global players during the Second World War, both, as I said in my text to the catalog, both proposing, suggesting, encouraging the Brazilian engagement with troops in the theatre of operation in Italy, and also provoking this exhibition to come here, to show that Brazil was a nation that could be part of this concert of great nations in 1944.
Of liberal democracies. No, absolutely. In fact, you touched upon a very interesting point there, which was, I suppose, perceptions of anti-Semitism, which unfortunately, very sadly, is only, seems to be on the rise again here in contemporary reality. But focusing on the actual exhibition, the original catalogue in 1944, which had an introduction by a member of the British upper class, and I'd like to kind of read it out to you, but it is quite extraordinary. It sounds pretty anti-Semitic, and I'll read it to you. That's British upper class critic Sitwell, and he says, "The progress of painting has been fast on this prolific soil, so fast that we may hope it will become slower and more serious." It's very patronizing. Up to this present, the influences have come from foreign exiles and from Brazilians returned from Paris. In the first respect, it might be said that the foreign blood has not been so far of first-rate quality. He's referring here to Jews and to people like Roberto Bullemarx, for instance, who had a Jewish father and a Roman Catholic mother. It's pretty anti-Semitic, and that's a British man from the British upper classes in 1944, in the middle of the war, whilst those atrocities were happening. So the perceptions of, of Jews and Jewish people, very sadly, absolutely awful, so across the board. And also bringing another person, the ambassador and former minister of Brazil, Rubens Recupero, who wrote a book, was published recently, The Diplomacy in the Construction of Brazil, which he basically sort of talks about the history of Brazilian diplomacy between 1750 to 2016. Very interesting book. He does talk a lot about Osvaldo Aranha and his huge importance, as you've mentioned, in sort of bringing Brazil to the liberal allied forces. But if it wasn't for Aranha, who was, in a very weird way, very close to Vargas, Vargas would not have perhaps taken that direction. Vargas made some pretty controversial speeches just before Brazil joined the allied forces, which could also be considered very anti-Semitic, and he makes references to Jews. Because of Aranha, Brazil accepted 9,000 Jews between 1938 and 1941, but actually less than Argentina and certainly the United States. And the extradition of communist Jewish women, Elise Ewert and Olga Benadio, back to Germany, and they were killed. So there was certainly in Brazil, and not only in Brazil, sort of an anti-Semitic discourse happening, which we cannot deny from our history.
Absolutely.
And if it wasn't for Osvaldo Aranha,
Yeah.
then the history could have been much darker. Don't you think so?
He's, as I said, a particular figure that I think is still not so well studied and valued in Brazilian history. All these elements you mentioned here made us remind again to write the macro history after the events and after all the tragedy of the Holocaust, in which we need to put us in a position. It's so easy because, oh, we sent troops, so we can say that we were defending the values of democracy and again defending or fighting for the end of the Nazism in Germany, who was provoking extermination of the Jewish people. But yeah, policies of anti-Semitism were current in Brazil as in many other countries. So racial segregation, and especially towards Jewish people, were common in US, in Britain.
In Britain, such as Sitwell's
exactly, and look at what happened in France too. You know, that the country was divided very clearly towards the question of the Jewish people. So it's so interesting, this game for Brazil, because it was an internal fight politically and diplomatically. We had, during the war, we had João Guimarães Rosa, our famous writer of O Grande Sertão Veredas, as consul in Hamburg, issuing visas illegally to Jewish to escape to Brazil. He and his wife Araci. We had Santiago Dantas in Paris.
Yeah, the ambassador, the Brazilian ambassador to Paris.
Exactly.
For 20 years.
Who escaped to the south when Paris was occupied. He was, until his last minute there, issuing visas
Jewish refugees.
Almost illegally for Jewish refugees. Yeah.
Against the will of Vargas, for instance.
Exactly, yeah. And we had some episodes of that. And the question of Osvaldo Aranha is peculiar. Osvaldo Aranha is the one who leads the vote in the United Nations Assembly for the creation of Israel state. So it is so peculiar that this man, he probably, I really don't know very well, I never read deeply what he wrote on this issue, but his actions really show a very different approach than many other politicians and intelligentsia in Brazil in this period regarding anti-Semitism. So I think his actions show that he was not as anti-Semitic as the environment was in Brazil, as was in many other countries in the world. And again, here I'm not saying nothing like that to sanctify one person and condemn other people. We need to look at that contextually speaking. And yeah, finally Brazil sent troops to the war. Finally Brazil sent troops to fight against fascism and Nazism. But living during a dictatorship with a quite fascist inspiration too.
Indeed.
So the paradox is more deep than we can imagine.
Yes.
No?
As it is usually with Brazil.
Yeah, exactly.
So that leads me to the other question, actually. So the achievements made by both Brazilian and British diplomats in the middle of the war in 1943 and 1944, highlighting then the enormous contribution by Brazil's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Osvaldo Aranha, to align Brazil with the Allied forces were extraordinary. I also would say that the efforts made by the diplomat and former attaché of the Embassy of Brazil in London, Aile Gadelha, your doctorate student,
Absolutely, yeah.
at King's, in resuscitating this huge historic forgotten episode by both sides of the Atlantic were formidable. Do you think that Brazil has succeeded in projecting an image of a modern country through the lenses of modernism?
I will subvert your question, if you allow me.
Of course.
I think the most and the biggest achievement from the people involved in that in 1943-44 and of Aile Gadelha here today with all the people involved in that is to prove the power of diplomacy, is to prove that in any moment of intolerance, in any moment, historical moment of divisions, conflicts, difficulties to dialogue, the power of diplomacy is the solution, first and foremost. So I think that's what this exhibition has as important to teach us. You know, in a period of war, to work hard and bring lots of pieces of art, find a place to exhibit here in London. It's a sign of goodwill to contribute to war effort. This is a huge, huge work. Some pragmatic person would say, oh, come on, let's do something easier. Let's just put a ship full of coffee and send to them. We'll be much more profitable.
The export product.
Exactly, but that would not provoke the diplomatic work that's necessary to that. And diplomatic work means solve problems, solve differences, find ways of dialogue, find ways of collaboration to a goal that is practical, an exhibition, but has a lot of consequences and results that we cannot measure. You know? And that's again the situation in this exhibition today. I follow up quite close all the work hard that was in putting together this exhibition here today. And besides being a fantastic exhibition of wonderful art, of Brazilian modern art, it also shows the goodwill that the diplomacy can provoke. And this goodwill that open doors, that put people together, that break walls of misunderstanding for a common goal that will have many other consequences that we cannot measure. And those are good consequences. So I'm sorry that I subvert your question, because I really don't know if we succeed in projecting an image of a modern Brazil, but we succeed in promote an image of a country that knows how to do diplomacy, who knows how to build up bridges.
That's a really good answer, actually, to the question, Dr. Vinicius. And I do think that perhaps you also imply that culture has this enormous power to reconcile countries, nations, and people, to bring people together, and countries together. I think using culture, and in this particular example I mentioned modernism, because Brazil is so internationally recognized by its modernism or modernist art, design, architecture, but using culture in general terms to tread diplomacy.
Yeah.
And it's interesting also to talk about Brazil's role on various different conflicts around the globe, historically, in broad terms, that historically Brazil has chosen mostly for sort of peaceful solutions and diplomatic solutions, as opposed to military solutions. So it's very interesting. Do you think Brazil is a soft power?
I think soft power is a tool. It's not an essential definition. That means I think Brazil as country has potential to operate diplomatically, globally, with soft power as a tool. I don't think that this is an absolute definition. This country is soft and that country is hard power. I think those are tools that, depending on the context, they need to be articulate diplomatically speaking. And I think Brazil is quite have a good ability in dealing with soft power tools towards the solution of conflicts and the establishment of relations, not only between Brazil and other countries, but also between two other countries in which Brazil comes to mediate solutions. So yes, I would say that this is a very important tool for Brazil, this concept of soft power.
It's interesting, the concept of soft power, isn't it? Because Brazil has been, for quite long now, trying to apply for a permanent position within the Security Council of the United Nations. And of course, in order to do that, you do have to have some kind of military tradition, and you have to be a military power. And I also remember I watched an interview with Presidente Fernando Henrique Cardoso, in which he said, do we prefer to be a country like the United States or a country like Canada? So I think it was a very interesting comment. Do we really want to be a military superpower and join the Security Council at the UN, or would we prefer to be a country like Canada that has got impeccable, sort of levels of social equality compared to the United States and so forth.
Yeah, I think a good point to bring here is that what I see in the discussion of Brazilian diplomacy towards the United Nations, and I think here it's a key point, it's much more, instead of we want a seat on the Security Council, is we want a reform of the Security Council, in which not only few countries, because of their military capabilities, will have power of veto over the concert of the nations. And I think here is the main argument of Brazil.
Right.
We want a reform of the Security Council. And this reform means perhaps remove the extra powers that some countries have,
right.
instead of asking that we want also that same powers.
Right.
No?
Right.
So I think it's very important to keep that in mind.
Right.
Our demand for reform of the Security Council should be driven much more for a promotion of a more equal perception of those countries in the concert of the nations than to put ourselves as one of those big powers there.
Right.
No? And I want to add another element here. I think it was around 2012, possibly. I was still working in Denmark in the University of Aarhus, and I managed to invite Gilberto Gil to talk at the university. Gilberto Gil was just leaving the Minister of Culture, where he worked for a while during first Lula government. And at that time, he was lecturing. Somebody asked him what Brazil needs to be a big power. What's the challenge for Brazil to be a big power? And his answer was, the challenge is not to become a big power. Because in order to become a big power, you need to exert this power over other people, other countries. And that's not exactly what we want for Brazil as a country. And I remember that very well, because I think here is again calling for the importance of the diplomacy. And is a possibility to sit and to talk to the other, not over an exercise of power. No? Mário Quintana, Brazilian poet, modernist poet too, he wrote once a sentence that diplomacy is to have the age of the person that you are talking to.
Right.
So, in other words, is to look at the other in the same level.
Right.
Yeah.
So
and I think that's the main point.
That's
here.
Interesting position by Brazilian intellectuals, and I certainly think that culture has a very key role to play. So I think Brazil really is a cultural power, worldwide recognized.
Yeah.
And I think this current exhibition here is just, exemplifies this.
Exactly.
And finally, in your view, what was the legacy left by the 1944 exhibition and the legacy left by the 2018 exhibition, the art of diplomacy in Anglo-Brazilian relations?
I think the main really point here is exactly this power of the diplomacy. Is the capacity that the diplomacy has to, as I said, build up bridges, remove walls, and through the art and through this art exhibition, touch people and make them help to understand each other in a different way. So I think those are the main goals that this exhibition got both there and now. I could say, oh yes, we are proving that Brazilian art is as good as European art. I don't think that is the question.
Yes.
The question is much more, what is the capacity? And the title of the exhibition, The Art of Diplomacy, says a lot. It says that the main goal is here, the diplomacy. Everybody engaged in this exhibition this year, they showed a commitment to Brazil, a commitment to put Brazil open to dialogue with Britain, and that is the main achievement, I think, of this exhibition.
It's a very interesting reflection, I think, because Prime Minister Theresa May has explicitly mentioned Brazil as this country leaves the European Union as one of the potential partners in terms of trade in particular, but I would also think in terms of cultural exchanges between the two countries, and we've got Brazil's current affairs. Brazil needs more partners, I suppose. So I think this exhibition has been able to achieve a lot of practical results as well. and I hope you'll manage to bring the two countries
Yeah.
More aligned together.
Absolutely, and also
Brazil's oldest ally.
yes, and also to show the plurality that Brazil is. No, each one of those paintings, they are a different history. They are a different color. They are absolutely different from each other. So one of these critics that I mentioned in the beginning of our talk, saying that the exhibition that didn't have a narrative in itself through the piece of art, it's because exactly that's the point.
Yes.
It's the plurality of it. It's not a unified and univocal country.
Yeah.
There are many artistical voices here, and this exhibition reinforces that. How the plurality of Brazil is reflected in the plurality of the Brazilian art.
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Vinicius, I'd very much like you also to take this opportunity to talk a little bit more about the book that's coming up. Briefly about your book that is going to be published soon, or has been published.
Yes, will be soon.
Soon.
You mentioned the music one, or
no, the ones that's coming up soon.
Oh yeah, the ones that coming up soon is a project I have together with Dr. Anne-Sophie Refsco from Surrey University and Dr. Marcel Amorim from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, in which we are bringing cultural anthropophagy as a sort of hermeneutical tool or horizon to discuss global Shakespeare.
Right.
So the books will be called Eating Shakespeare, and we invited scholars from all over the world, not only Brazilian scholars, to discuss how they could, using the cultural anthropophagy concept from Oswald, dialoguing it with Viveiros de Castro perspectivism, and apply this to read how we could talk about global Shakespeare without having that idea that, well, Shakespeare is something value that Britain is giving to the world, but it's much more how the world is eating this Shakespeare, no?
Devouring Shakespeare. Yeah.
Devouring Shakespeare, absolutely, no? And then that is the project currently in process of edition. So very soon this book will be coming out, and I hope that will be a contribution in a syntactical level, not in a paradigmatical level. I hope that what we are bringing there as theoretical keys will help us to look at Shakespeare not as a syntaxis that we will just put a language on the top, but in the opposite, it must shift its own syntaxis in order to be global.
Right, fantastic. Well, I certainly very much look forward to reading it.
Thank you.
Dr. Vinicius, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
You.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Grande órgão propulsor, transformador do sangue, venoso em arterial. Coração, não és sentimental, mas entretanto dizem que és o cofre da paixão. Coração, não estás do lado esquerdo, nem tão pouco do direito, ficas no centro do peito, eis a verdade. Tu és pro bem-estar do nosso sangue, o que a casa de correção é para o bem da humanidade. Coração de sambista brasileiro, quando bate no pulmão, faz a batida do pandeiro. Eu afirmo, sem nenhuma pretensão, que a paixão faz dor no crânio, mas não ataca o coração. Conheci um sujeito convencido, com mania de grandeza e instinto de nobreza, e por saber que o sangue azul é nobre, gastou todo seu pobre sem pensar no seu futuro, não achando quem lhe arrancasse as veias onde corre o sangue impuro, viajou abraçou alguém que conseguisse encher-lhe as veias com azul de metileno pra ficar com sangue azul. Sambista brasileiro, quando bate no pulmão, faz a batida do pandeiro.